that's when I've done it. The book is broken down into some sort of order that's going to change on the second climb. But this is the point where I take all those first thoughts and put them together into an outline. And I'm going to show it. I brought, this is show and tell here, I brought the outline for my novel Plague. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you all there. We're all gathered again for the fourth workshop. I'm going to do what I always do at the very start, which is a brief recap of what's gone before, because anyone coming in will perhaps struggle slightly with some of my analogies and my terminology if they haven't heard some of the original stuff. So I'm just going to praise it. I'm not going to go over a huge amount of that because we've got quite a lot of ground to cover today, as always. So I call these workshops The Mountain, the novel as a series of ascents. And even though I'm largely here as the fantasy writer in residence because of my fantasy writing, I'm also a historical fiction writer and a modern crime writer. My last book was modern crime. So my stuff, though I do make some references to fantasy all through it, is going to cover all sorts of things. Really, it's about writing your novel. So, and in fact, even some of the things I'm going to be saying are about constructing a book. So if you're doing even non-fiction or you're writing short stories, whatever, it's largely about process. That's the word you're going to hear from me again and again. It's about process. Because I believe that what stops a lot of people writing is thinking that they have to be good straight away and that they don't understand that it's a process. It's a series of stages. So I like to break everything down and simplify my life as much as possible in all areas of my life. And writing is definitely one of those. What stopped me writing for years was thinking I wasn't good enough. I'd write stuff. I'd have all these great ideas, I thought at the time, and I'd pound them out there. But then when I reread them later, I didn't feel they were worthy, certainly not worthy of standing beside some of the writers I admired so much. So I threw them aside and didn't write for years. And then when I finally realized, and it was a gradual realization, but I finally realized that it was about process, about dividing the stages of the process up. So each one has its very specific purpose. The first draft is really about telling yourself the story. It's about getting to know your characters, letting your characters tell the story. And so I always suggest when you're writing your first draft that you have three main rules. Remove the words good or bad from the vocabulary. Neither apply. You'll find that they don't apply much at all at any stage of the process, but there's a different reason for even considering them. The rule number 2 is don't look down. When you're climbing the mountain, you don't want to be looking down a lot. You think, oh, I'm so high, I might fall off. Keep going up, keep pushing forward. And anything I say, I should caution that all writers have their own process, right? Their own way of approaching things. I'm saying this works for me. I think it works for people who are starting out because it is a simple process. But if you found yourself, oh, I haven't done that, or Chris says I shouldn't do that, don't worry. You're all going to find your own way up the mountain. But if you're following largely my idea, that idea of don't look down, is you keep going. Don't do a lot of rereading. You do a lot of rereading, you want to do a lot of editing. You do a lot of editing, you want to start changing your first thought, which is where you want to really be on that first ascent up the mountain. The final rule I have for that first ascent, which is really the first draft, is don't show your first draft to anyone. This comes with some problems. If you're part of a writing group or things like that, you're expected to show up with something for other people to critique. But what I often find is that if you make the rule you're not showing it to anyone, then you're free to write whatever you want. You're free to let the mind do what it does best, which is to write, to create stories. And if you are already hamstrung by the idea that Aunt Martha is going to read the fact that you've ever thought about sex, then you're probably not going to write the thing you need to write at this stage. If no one's ever going to see it, you're free to write everything. The characters are vital. And I quote these, I give two quotes, which I'll give again because it's always worth remembering these things. One is by a very good writer called John York, who wrote a book called Into the Woods, which is one of the best books about writing, particularly structured writing, how to structure a story that I know. I don't read a lot of writing books, but I did read that one because he's from the BBC and he has all these great ideas. It's called Into the Woods, How Stories Work and Why We Tell Them is the subtitle. He says about character, the central character has to have an active goal. They desire something. If they don't, then it's almost impossible to care for them. I think that's important. The other quote was from an English writer, playwright, musical man called Noel Coward. And he said, let your characters dictate your plot rather than your plot dictate your characters. And it's you know, everything is a bit of a compromise in writing. You know, it's not all one thing or another. Of course, plot is going to affect your characters and vice versa. One of the big words I use all the time, which is going to come in quite a lot in the second draft, which I'm going to talk about shortly, is the word oscillation, how the various elements of a book will oscillate between each other. So you'll oscillate from the character to the plot, the research, the history perhaps you're writing, or the world building you're doing, and the character. All these things go back and forth, and the mind wonderfully can handle all that. If you don't keep saying to the mind, oh, that's not right, or that's not very good, if, at least on the first draft, you keep pushing through. I have this shorthand, which I think some of you who have joined me before will know, but for those who haven't, it's called COMOCA. COMOCA, and it stands for characters, objectives, meeting obstacles, creates action. It's a way of writing. It's a way of cutting to the chase, as they say. It's a way of saying, you know, your character wants this. It's what John York said about an active goal. They want this. What's stopping them getting it? Write that. I'm going to do characters more in a special workshop, but it's just worth bearing in mind, COMOCA. And the last thing I want to say about the recap is writing is writing. It's the secret of writing. Here it is on my board. I think you can see that there. Writing is writing. Because I really believe in almost getting out of your own way, allowing the process to do it. I mean, you say, oh, well, you know, I'm writing. What do you mean writing is writing? If you just allow yourself, remember, we're not good or bad. We're just allowing ourselves to be simple. We're keeping going. You'll get a first draft. Now we come on to what we're going to talk about today, mainly, which is the second draft. And again, there will be lots of oscillation between character and plot and research, plot and world building, all the things you were doing. But what you've done, if we go back to the analogy of the mountain, is you've free climbed to the top of the mountain. You've got to the top of the mountain. Now, if you've finished the first draft, I have to say to you, congratulations, you've done more than 95% of people who say they want to write a book have done. You've completed the first draft. There's a huge power in just finishing a draft because you've got it. It's sitting there. It's ready to be played with. It's rough. Of course it's rough because it was meant to be. There was no other priority but to get it written. There's an old screenwriter's analogy which talks about this, and they say, don't get it right, get it written. And it's really a useful thing to remember. Don't get it right. Details will come later. Get it written. Now, I talked about how I don't outline very much. And it's not true to say that, you know, it's completely free form and I have no idea who my characters are and I have no idea what the story is I'm going to tell. What I likened it to was an alphabet, to mix my metaphors, that I'm climbing the mountain. You know, I'll know A, because I'm on the ground with A, that my character, the highwayman in Plague, is about to do a robbery. I know D, because D is the point where he discovers that the people he's going to rob are all murdered by someone who's obviously come before him. I might know H, where the thief taker tries to arrest him. I might know M, where the plague breaks out. I might know all these things, but I don't necessarily know how I'm going to get between them. And so that's my way up the mountain. And I get to Z, or Z if anyone's watching from America, and there I am. Now this is when I do a proper outline. I haven't done one till then. I'll know some of the things. It's not that I haven't written down stuff. You know, this is the day the theatres were closed in London in 1665 because of the Great Plague. I know that I'll probably want to set a scene there with most of my characters somehow gathered. You'll find later on that stories, particularly in structure, have certain points. They're very prescribed in film writing, less so in novel writing, but you'll find that stories tend to work the same way. And so there'll be a point where it's like the end of Act 1. They talk about screenplays being a 3-act structure normally. The end of Act 1 will be the point where your characters are, and it's usually a point of peril. Another thing I say of, you know, what I write with characters is characters in action, and often characters in peril, because peril is quite interesting. Now, so when I say that I don't do an outline, I really don't do an outline. I don't do that classic, this happens here, this happens here. There are a lot of writers who do. I've spoken to 2 of them in this interview series I'm doing for VPL. Evan Winter, about 3 weeks ago, and then 2 nights ago, Silvia Moreno Garcia, a writer of Mexican Gothic. Evan is a huge outliner. He writes a 250-page outline and then knows everything that's going to happen. Silvia is pretty close, I believe. She tends to know a lot as well. I don't know that much, partly because of the simplicity thing. Let my characters tell me what the plot is. But when I've climbed to the top of the mountain, that's when I've done it. The book is broken down into some sort of order that's going to change on the second climb. But this is the point where I take all those first thoughts and put them together into an outline. And I'm going to show it. This is show and tell here, I brought the outline for my novel Plague. Plague, I'm happy to say, won the Arthur Ellis Best Crime Novel in Canada in 2015. And it's essentially a religious fundamentalist serial killer story set during the Great Plague of London. So this is, I'll hold it up to the camera. I don't know how closely you can see that. There you go. This is Plague, the outline. And you can see what I do is, over here, I had it on, I flew into Vancouver this morning, had my bag in the hold, and they managed to get it slightly wet. So some of my outline got a bit wet and faded here, which is annoying. Anyway, I do it on butcher's paper because it's big. I write down here, I write the chapters. Over here, I'm not one of these, I'm not particularly, not a scrapbooker or anything like that. I don't tend to do things like this very much, but I actually get off on doing this. I draw all these lines. There's the number of the chapter and the page it's at down this right side here. There is the title of the chapter. In this case, the first chapter is called The Highwayman. The second chapter is called The Thief Taker. Then it says here, characters and actions. And I write down roughly, and this is interesting. I'm not actually talking about reading the whole book through. I'm going through the book, doing an outline. I'll come on to this, but I don't actually reread the book once I've written the first draft. I start again from the beginning and go up the mountain again. So here's this, and then here are notes I make. When I'm already seeing stuff that's appearing here, what the characters and the action. I'll give you an example here. So in the chapter called The Butcher, I have this character who is a butcher called Abel Strong in a different part of London. I think he was in the city originally. And I thought, no, I want to put him in St. Giles, which is this other amazing part of London where I actually worked as a teenager, near Soho. So I thought, change it to St. Giles. And here's another example here. Oh yeah, this is where the puppeteer appears. The puppeteer is going to be a very important character in this book, and actually a major character in the second book, the sequel to Plague, which is called Fire. So I said, reveal more of puppeteer. So I'm making these notes, but you see there's not a lot of notes. The odd thing is, And there's, part 2, part 1, part 2. The yellow down here was oddly, I went back and tried to write a TV version. So the yellow with lines about my TV version. The odd thing is that I write this and I stick it up on a cork board by my desk, but then I actually don't look at it very much. It's kind of like the mind is tricked into knowing that there is now this clear structure. But what it does as well, when I've looked at it initially for a couple of days, I realized that, say the villain has appeared here for the first time in chapter 3, and then doesn't seem to appear again until chapter 17. Well, that's no good. You've got to have the villain more often. So I have to I've got to find ways of introducing him more. If we went back to the idea of the mountain, you're at the top of the mountain, you've climbed the mountain by the most, the expeditious route that you want to take, but you're looking down from the top going, why did I go there? That's a detour perhaps you made, and you make a note of that. Why isn't the puppeteer more featured? To give you another example from Plague, when I got all the way through the first draft, the central, if there is one protagonist, there's really 3 protagonists in Plague: the highwayman, the thief taker, and the actress. But if I looked at the main guy who we start with, Captain Coke, who we follow, the highwayman, I realized he was a very isolated figure. That's what I got from looking at the route. So I knew in my second draft, in my second climb, what was a way to make him more isolated, less isolated? How do I reveal more of his character? Because he was isolated, he wasn't interacting with people. So how is he going to be able to show his character off? How is he going to reveal himself? And so I thought, aha! And this is a great tip, slightly to the side, a sidebar on what we're discussing today. But there's nothing like a sidekick. A sidekick is a great, useful character. You need a sidekick to be able to talk to. You need a sidekick to be able to show how your character reacts to other people. I realized that I needed to get Coke a sidekick. And I thought, well, how would, what? Because he's cut himself off. He's suffering from the 17th century equivalent of PTSD pretty badly. That's why he's a highwayman. He can't, he can't operate in the normal world anymore. But so how do I show someone who's got that caring instinct still? And I thought I'd find him a sidekick who he saved. He found him basically starving to death, covered in snow on his front door at his lodgings. And he takes him in, and this boy is called Dickon. Named Dickon because I'm thinking, what's how I'm going to call him? And there on my desk was my lovely cat, Dickon. So I thought, I'm going to call him Dickon. Alas, no longer with us, Dickon. So I called him Dickon, and he became this amazing character. And of course, once that character happened in the second draft, the route changed again. Coke did this as opposed to that. And so that started, I'm shaping it again. Now, the key about the second draft, there's lots of different things you can apply, but again, I don't tend to use the words good or bad about the second draft. You could the useful question is not, is it good or bad? The useful question is, does it work? Does it work? And by work, I mean, you almost have to, American Idol all your scenes. If we think about what really makes a scene work, it should almost tick various boxes. And I often, when I'm going into schools, into high schools and teaching this sort of stuff, I say, so, what boxes do you need a scene to tick? And people will go, well, it's got to advance the plot. You go, yep, it has to advance the plot. It also, it should develop the character. Yes, it should develop the character. It should give those characters context in the world. Yes, it should. Your world building, which was the subject of last week's workshop. But what people often don't say, occasionally they do, the number one thing is you want to keep your reader reading. So it doesn't mean it has to be all laughs or all action or anything like that, but it's got to intrigue in some way. There's got to be, if not a question around it, there's got to be something that's going to make you go, oh, I think I'll just read another chapter. I love it when I get emails from people, which I do reasonably often, where people saying, well, thanks a lot, because I had to stay up till 4 a.m. finishing One London Day, because I actually couldn't put it down. Great. That's exactly what you want to hear as a writer. So that's an important thing to think of as you're going up the second draft, because, and I should backtrack slightly here because we're going to come on and discuss this more. What is the purpose of the second draft? Again, there's a bit of a checklist, but you're trying to clarify the story for yourself, certainly. You know, you're looking at those routes you took up the mountain and thinking, Captain Coke's a little isolated, give him a sidekick. You know, in One London Day, my modern thriller, there was no real villains. And so I wrote in this whole group of very nasty villains, one particular. And that changed that second climb up the mountain, of course, because then you're factoring in more characters and you're oscillating again between plot and research, and characters' objectives have changed because there's a new kid on the block. So when you're doing that, when you're moving between that plot and that character, and you're seeing your way up the mountain, well, I suppose it's just changing things again. You also factor in what the character had been. Characters develop, hopefully characters develop. And sometimes characters develop out of proportion to what you originally considered. Be prepared to be surprised. This is the Humphreys technique. If you keep fairly open, a character has an opportunity to surprise you. In my fantasy series, Immortal's Blood, the first book's called Smoke in the Glass. There were 2 characters in it who I thought, they'll be gone by the end of book 1. There's going to be a trilogy. End of book 1, they've been useful stepping stones, but they're gone. And they would not let me let them go. They just would not. By the end, both those characters became 2 of the more intriguing and most important characters in the whole series. So by using this method of being, open to surprise, by allowing your characters to dictate your plot, you're going to, it opens up a variety of opportunities for you that might not have existed if you absolutely prescriptive about how things go. If something changes on that second climb as you're writing it, you're American Idoling each scene, you're doing that checklist, you're thinking about this new character, how are they interacting? You've got to give them a chance to prove themselves almost. If they're auditioning for a major role in your story, then you have to give them an opportunity to convince you that they need to remain. And that's going to be by keeping open, allowing their actions, because we go back to character in action, to surprise you, perhaps. I come back to purpose, which is where I started, really. The purpose of the second draft, clarification for yourself, but ultimately what you're doing is laying down a route for someone else to follow you up the mountain. By the end of the second draft, by the time you've done all the things I've been talking about, you've developed your characters, you've introduced new ones, you've allowed them to establish themselves, you've added things to other characters, someone is going to follow you up the mountain. Someone is going to take this same route. If I'm not a mountain climber, but I believe there are things called pitons, which get hammered into the rock face, and people go up routes, up mountains. So if the first climb was a free climb, when you did, without ropes, it's a mountain, you can, it's an imaginary mountain, you can do what you want. I wouldn't climb a mountain like that. But anyway, that's what you do. You free climb up it. This draft is about going, okay, this worked, this didn't work, this worked, this character shouldn't have gone there. Let's make him or her go here instead. Or this unicorn needs to do this, which I've also written about unicorns. By the time you get to the top of the mountain on the second draft, the second ascent, you're ready for someone else to read it. And so I'm going to talk now really about the role of that person in your life. But I have to say that the second draft is my favorite part of the process. And I'll tell you what, you've already got something for a start, so that's good. You've done what so many writers don't do, as I said before, and you've actually completed something. But also, you're playing with things. It's nuance. It's not about, huge slabs of cutting normally that might come into it. I've got a few stories to tell you about working with editors in that regard. But it's more about calibration. Okay, this didn't work, this didn't work, this did work. How do I expand on that? I didn't pursue that enough. So you're fine-tuning. When I'm writing a first draft, I'm usually good for about, I start writing quite early in the morning, 7:30, something like that. I'm usually done by lunchtime because, just that thing of creating all the time is quite draining. It's exciting. And the absolute favorite moments of any book that I'm writing occur when it feels like you're taking dictation, when suddenly something happens that using writing is writing, as that, you're writing and it's writing and this character. And I mean, sometimes I just chortle. I'm just sitting there going, you couldn't, but that happens like 4 times, maybe less in a first draft. But when you've got that whole stuff to play with, oh my God, I mean, I have to be driven from my writing place by hounds, really, because I'm just so excited. I can see this analogy and this analogy, and this is going to work. Now, I'm going to talk about the role of the editor now. But first, I should really talk about who is the editor. Most of us, especially, as I suspect many people out there are in the early stages of their writing career, are still writing, hoping to get a publication deal. Hoping to, or to decide which way they're going to go. There are more opportunities now than there were when I was a lad, when I was starting out. Self-publishing wasn't really on. Now it's one of the biggest games in town, of course. But when I started writing novels, which is actually only about 20 years ago, traditional was the way to go. And there's all sorts of things. I mean, I'm going to do a workshop. Probably the very last one I do in this series is going to be talking about the business and how you approach it. Because there's pluses and minuses on all sorts of sides about publishing, self-publishing, small presses, all that stuff. But so for me, getting an editor meant a professional editor. And when I signed my first contract for the French Executioner, which ended up being 2 books. They offered me a 2-book deal, which was extraordinary at the time to me. It still is slightly extraordinary. I then was assigned an editor. And I have to say this is the only time this has happened to me, because I'd written, it was my second draft I delivered, and they really liked it. It was a story about the man who killed Anne Boleyn. It was completely mad and great fun and quite funny and quite sad and, just very adventurous. The editor said, yeah, it's about 25,000 words too long. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? That can't be true. My glorious words, I labored over them, But when I got her notes, I began to see exactly what she meant. And I ended up cutting 33,000 words because it was just, all the stuff that you don't quite know as a writer yourself, how to set up this story better. Because what an editor does is clarify your vision. That's their most important function. I'm going to talk a little more about that in a second, but I just want to go back to who your editor could be. These days, and this is one of the big changes in the business in the last 20 years, often if you're fortunate enough to land an agent, your agent is normally your first editor. There's a lot of houses who really don't accept manuscripts unless they've already been pre-edited. Don't get me started on the iniquities of modern publishing and the slashing of editorial departments and all that stuff, because it is a problem, I think. But the fact, this is what you're working with, and your agent, if you get an agent, they will often be your first stop. They're not simply about the deal anymore. They're very much about shaping the story for the market, which in itself can be an issue, of course. That's another story, writing for the market. But so if it's not an agent, who do you get? I would, if you can, find a professional editor. If you can afford it, do it, because it's going to make a huge difference. Because what you want is someone who doesn't personally care about you, really. So if you go to your partner, your life partner, or your sister, or your mother, or your father, or someone, or a close friend, they're going to have a personal relationship with you. It's kind of like, they say about going to see a psychiatrist. You don't want your psychiatrist to be your best friend, right? You want them to be a professional that you pay to give you feedback. And it really is best if you can do that with your second draft, which you've delivered. You're all going to have your own things here, but it's if you can. Now, again, a word of caution, there are a lot of people out there who'd be willing to take your money and do very little in terms of making your book better, which is what an editor needs to do. So be very careful. Anyone who says they're a publisher and you have to pay them money for them to publish you, don't do that. Unless they're a very reputable small press who are going to help you get to publication. I can think of people like Friesen Press in Victoria, or Page 2, the newer company in Vancouver. They're very reputable people. They wouldn't take a book on unless they thought it had legs, as they say. So let me just go back a bit more over what the editor does. There are misconceptions around an editor. Number one is that your editor, or it's actually things you often believe yourself, especially when you're starting out and you don't have a lot of confidence, that your editor knows your book better than you do. They don't. They can see things, but they don't know the book better than you. So often I found with an editor's note, they'll say, on page 45, this happened, but I didn't, quite understand, why. And then you think, the fix actually isn't on page 45. I didn't set it up properly on page 16. That's the sort of thing that you can work with an editor. Another misconception is that an editor's job is to impose their vision on your book. It's not. There's a wonderful old British expression, you don't buy a dog and bark yourself. They're buying your vision. That's what they want to help you achieve that vision. The best editors completely understand this. They're dispassionate about it. They want to make your book the best book that you can write. I have an analogy from the theatre that really I was told once, and I thought, well, that's so much about anything to do with the creative process. There was a theatre director I knew working at Stratford, Ontario, and he had a very sharp assistant director, a young woman who had come in to, intern basically at Stratford and learn the trade. And she was very smart. And he came to rely on her. And when he was, in the final stages of rehearsal, he would be rehearsing a scene. At the end of the scene, the actors would go off and he'd turn to her and say, well, and she'd say, this is what I saw. Is that what you want? It's great, because if an editor says that to you, this is what I saw, is that what you want? That's kind of their job. And you might go, no, that's not what I want at all. That's the wrong idea at this stage of the book. Or, yes, that's exactly what I want. Or maybe there's some calibration in between. So that's what an editor does. I had in one of the plays I wrote, Shakespeare's Rebel, which is an adaptation of my novel, Shakespeare's Rebel. It went on at Bar on the Beach in 2015. And I had this wonderful dramaturge called Martin Kinch. Really, really understood theatre so well. I'd actually known him for years, and he was also my thesis advisor, in fact. Martin Kinch, wonderful. No one in Canada, probably in North America, knows story better. Anyway, he said to me, he'd be horrified if a writer implemented every suggestion he made. But that's not his job. So clarity, establishing clarity, trying to make your ideas clear. That's what an editor does. And where you sometimes have a discussion with them, and we're still talking about this second climb up the mountain, what you've set up for your editor, you might be aiming for ambiguity. But ambiguity is not the same as lack of clarity. I like ambiguity because it's intriguing. You leave something open. But if it's just unclear, that's not so good. And often an editor will help you decide the difference between that. So I already told you about the French executioner. I'll give you a couple of examples. There's I've had disagreements with editors before, never to the falling out phase, because I always assume that they want the best for my vision of the book. You know, you couldn't work with them if they didn't. So I remember with my novel, Plague, actually. Let me go back to Plague. My editor suggested that there was an opportunity to turn it into a mystery as well as a crime story. And that was having seen my second draft. I'd kind of revealed the villain quite early. And she said, I'm not sure you need to do that. And so I went back and rejigged it. So I didn't. So there was a big surprise. With Fire, which was the sequel to Plague, there was a very interesting thing I had with my editor there. She'd edited Plague as well. And I sent her Fire, so I was quite pleased with. And she came back and said, well, you've opened with the wrong characters. And I went, what? She said, yeah, you've got to start, it's a sequel, you've got to start with your main characters again. And I'd kind of started with this subsidiary character, building up to the appearance of my heroes. And she was entirely right. And I sort of, the thing about editors' notes often is you can be quite grumbly about them for a few days, and then you go, oh, she's right. She's right. And it's often a she, it's usually a she. She's right, 90% of the time, I would say. And if she's wrong, she might not be entirely wrong. She just might not be right in the area because you know your book better than anyone else. So it was the only time, and that was, Fire was my 15th novel. It's the only time I've just scrapped the first 80 pages and rewritten them entirely. The problem with editors often is, though, that they leave. So she said, oh yeah, you should rewrite the opening. And oh, by the way, I'm moving publishing houses. And she was gone. So I never had her again, which was a pity. She was great. I suppose one other book that springs to mind where there was a disagreement was Chasing the Wind, which is my novel about the 1930s aviatrix, Roxy Lowen. And in that one, I wrote this, what I thought was quite a good sex scene. I'm going to do a workshop which is about action scenes. And I've combined, I used to teach the sex scene, writing the sex scene, and I called it Write the Good Fight, which is how to write fights. And I now combine them too, because they're remarkably similar, actually, and they're action scenes. Scenes of development, character, scenes of, and I wrote this scene, it was reasonably explicit. It was nothing, X-rated, but it was reasonable. And she said, don't think we need it. I was going, well, we can't be too prudish here and all that stuff. Well, she was right. She was right. We didn't need it. It became much more sexy, actually, when the mechanics, which is part of the problem of the sex scene, the mechanics were removed. Where I had a disagreement with her was when an element of political correctness crept in, when we had this one German flyer, and they're down in Ethiopia, Abyssinia it was called at the time, fighting the Italians who were using mustard gas, destroying whole villages, And he at one point said those damn itais. And she said, oh, itai is a derogatory term for Italians. And I went, yep, it is. And it's exactly what they used to say. They had to, so it was a 1930s thing. You want me to be politically correct for this character who hates the people who are doing these murders? And she said, well, yeah, I wouldn't put it in. I said, well, we're putting it in. And in the end, whose book is it? It's your book. Let me, because I see we're fast approaching running out of time, and I want to leave some time for some questions. I'm hoping there will be some questions. Feel free, stick them in the chat, and I'm happy to answer any. I will just say, again, bringing it all back to the idea of process. Even though you're aiming for that editor, the second climb is about someone else reading it, right? So that's different from the first climb, which was definitely not about anyone else reading it. Don't show your first draft to anyone. The second draft is about that. So you then have to test your own tolerance around sex scenes or around, action or around politics. It depends what you're writing, of course, or fantasy. How extreme can this world be in its treatment of women or animals or, all those sort of things. You have to start asking yourself those questions now. But as I said, it's not about good or bad. It's about whether it works in the context of your story. So just thinking about that second climb up the mountain, it has different priorities, but a lot of the same things apply. And the interesting thing when I use the word oscillation, of course, the oscillation between plot and character and all that, in the second draft, you're often oscillating between second draft and first draft because you're discovering stuff you need to write about. There might be 3 extra chapters going in, which is all first draft stuff. So again, you would probably excise good or bad or anything other than getting these chapters out, but then go back and edit them into the form of a second draft. So there's a bit of that goes on. There's overlap between the drafts, as there will be between the second draft and the third draft, which is the draft that everyone signs off on. Has anyone got any questions? Mr. Levitt, Paul Levitt says, when I started writing scientific papers, a wise old professor told me to put the first draft in a drawer for a few weeks and forget about it. Do you let your first draft rest for a while? It's very interesting, that, Paul. I sometimes, there's a crime writer from Washington State, very successful, called Robert Degoni. Some of you may know him. He teaches at the Surrey Writers' Conference a lot. And Bob is a former lawyer and a good friend. I like Bob a lot. And we teach workshops together sometimes about this process, about first draft, second draft. He is a big subscriber to, and I remember we were teaching this workshop together, and he kind of has all these bullet points and everything, and I'm much more sort of loosey-goosey. I'm like the color commentator in a sporting game. And he's going, yes, and so when you finish your first draft, you stick it in the bottom of the drawer and you don't look at it for another month. And there was a beat, and then I said, or you go into the house, make a cup of tea, come back and start reading. It's really up to you. I like to dive straight in again. I like to go through the first draft, do my outline. I'm having withdrawal symptoms at the moment because Sunday before, I finished the first draft of my new novel, which is a World War II novel called Sonata at Midnight. It's been a very long process to get this book done, much longer than my normal process, but the first draft is complete. It's the longest thing I've ever written. It's over the longest period of time. I'm itching to get back to it. I wouldn't stick it in a bottom drawer. I would like to dive back in and start rereading now, but I can't because I'm employed by VPL to do things. I'm also an audiobook narrator, and I've got a book on the go with that, and I'm also editing. The other extreme of the writing process is when they send you what are called page proofs. And my fantasy trilogy, Immortal's Blood, first book, Smoke in the Glass, second book, The Coming of the Dark, third book is called The Wars of Gods and Men. And I've just been sent the page proofs for that. And I have to go through and send them back notes, either because I've noticed an incongruity or because and this is the case here, it's actually, get me started on the publishing business again, but they're not taking as much care as they used to. So there's lots of technical mistakes. I see Linda nodding away there. It's true. Okay, Scott, author of Into the Woods, Carla, is John York, York with an E on the end. Linda says, do you save your drafts in different documents? Yes, yeah, I would make a copy of draft one, and then start editing that. Scott said, somebody once said that if a reader or editor tells you there's a problem with your writing, they're 99% likely to be right. Whereas if they tell you they know how to fix it, they're 99% likely to be wrong. Ha! Well, that's interesting. Do you find that to be true? Editor's value is identifying problems, not solutions. No, I don't feel that. And I don't, a problem with your writing is a bit of a loaded phrase, of course, Scott. What do they mean by that? Is it not working? Is it like that assistant director at Stratford saying, this is what I see, is that what you want? Maybe that could be called a problem, but again, it's one of those words I don't particularly like. There's something either working or not working. So if an editor identifies a problem, it's not really a problem. It's they're not clear about what you're intending to do at this point. It's about clarity. The more you can think about it with an editor, that it's about clarifying your vision, not imposing theirs, the better. And editors, do I find that editors' value is identifying problems, not solutions? I think the best editors help you to find the solution. They'll say, if this happens, if they're suggesting how you can fix it, I don't think they're giving you the opportunity to fix it. Going back to that idea that you know your book better than anyone, it's important to, criticism is that word we think, someone's criticizing me. Criticism is not a pejorative word. Criticism is an analysis, and an editor should be a critic in the best sense of the word, i.e. they're analyzing it and this is what they see. I don't think I think the percentages are interesting. You hear is 99% likely to be right. Yeah, not necessarily. Because in the end, it's just an opinion, right? And we all know what opinions are. They're just someone's opinion. Now, if you trust your editor, you're more likely to take their opinion as something that really has to be considered. But going back to what I said, no one knows your book better than you do. And so you can take their idea and attempt to make it clearer, but it might not be the fix that they want necessarily, but or the fix that they've suggested. Though, as I say, I'm not sure you want them to be suggesting, oh yeah, just do this and it'll be fine. Apart from that editor who said to me, you started in the wrong place. Absolutely right, I had. But she didn't say, so write this sort of scene instead. She said, just go back to your main characters and how would you reintroduce them? And I went, aha. Well, a pub, of course. Because I like writing book stories set in pubs. So, but yeah, interesting thoughts. Yeah, just going back to that part of the process, it's an interesting place to be at the moment, that I'm in the diametrically opposite stages of the process. I began the climb up the Immortal's Blood mountain 4 years ago, and I'm now reading the page proofs for the final book of that. So there's been, if you're writing a series, of course, could be another workshop, but you're into a different, it's like several mountains. It's like the Himalayas, or it's like you're doing 7 peaks in the Highlands of Scotland. That's slightly different. And we could talk about that whole thing of the arc of the story, how the overall arc is spread over I don't know if you can see me waving my hands here. The overall arc is spread over 3 books, perhaps, if you're doing a series, or 7 books, or however many it is. But each book also has to be a self-contained entity, a discrete entity. With Sonata, Sonata at Midnight, my World War II story is called, it's a one-off. My agent, used to be my editor, is now my agent in London. He's like, oh, no, you must write a sequel. You must have a sequel idea. And I'm going, no, don't want to write a sequel. It's a one-off, which is causing a bit of friction between the two of us at the moment. Not bad. I mean, we've known each other so long. But I'm very excited to get back to the next stage, the second climb. I'm going to be doing an outline for Sonata at Midnight sometime in the next couple of weeks. I'm going to be trying to see what the hell it is I've written. And it's very exciting. I think every stage of the process is exciting. It's got different imperative. But for me, to have something written, to have completed that first ascent, and then to be able to go back in and go, oh, this is what it is. Okay, why did I do that? I did that because, and I didn't follow it through. So if I was to summarize, I would just say, keep it simple. Keep making it about what works as opposed to whether it's good or bad. Find yourself a good editor, and that would be about it. One last question from Paul here, and then we have to conclude. Do you go back and forth between chapters in your first draft? Back and forth between chapters. Do you mean, going back and fixing something and then moving on and then coming back and fixing it again? Yeah, in your first draft, no. Your first draft, I just keep going. I might read a couple of pages back. And if it's the beginning of a new chapter, I might go, where did I leave that? Oh, okay, yeah. But no, I don't go back and forth because I don't want to, there's nothing to fix. The fix will come later. The fix will come on what we've been talking about today, which is the second draft. That's when you fix stuff. The first draft is about something entirely different. The first draft is about the story. What is the story? Tell yourself the story. So thank you, everyone. Take care. Happy writing.